My name is Sarah. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome to those of you who maybe are running across this as your first experience with this channel. If you are here, you probably have watched the first half of this story in my other video. But if you are new here, welcome. I just want to say thank you for being here. And I am filming the second part of my story today. If you haven't seen the first half, I just invite you to pause this video and head over to the other video that I will link in the description box, because in it is where I describe a lot of the context for this video. I describe how I grew up, and it has a lot to do with my story and how I've experienced things and how things have turned out in my life. So you do not want to miss that. Otherwise it might be a little bit harder to understand this part of the story. But if you have seen that video already and you were blessed by it or you were encouraged by it, I just want to say that today I am so excited, because this part of the story is really where it gets super good. It gets inspiring and just life-giving. So thank you for being here and being a part of my story by watching it. Without further deliberation, let's just get right to it. Heavenly Father, I just pray that every single person who sees this video would experience love through my story, would experience encouragement, would experience hope, and would experience life. I pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So the place that I left off in my story last was where I was living in Korea, and I had just had a really profound sort of revelation about the trajectory of my life and who God is to me. And that has gone on to shape the entire rest of my story. I just want to, again, provide a little caveat that I will be describing some things that might be triggering for some viewers related to mental health and my eating disorder that I experienced. So I will again provide timestamps for that on the video, so that if you don't feel comfortable watching those parts, you can still skip past it and still see the other parts of the story that are not quite as explicit. Also, this story is not really intended for children, so if you have a little one nearby, just make sure you choose an appropriate time to watch the video. So I want to dive back in and describe some more of the remaining time that I was in Korea, because I think it's important to give you context. I did start to describe that somewhat, but I want to go back and provide a little bit more detail, because I think it was a really important time in my life, and it has a lot to do with the way things have gone on from there. After I had that revelation that I don't have to do things on my own, because Jesus actually came to earth and became a human being so that I didn't have to be self-sufficient and I didn't have to fix myself or heal myself or save myself, I continued living in Korea, because it was about November when I had that sort of revelation, I think. But I found a lot more comfort than I had previously in a church community. I went and joined a church community in the small town where I was living, and there were a couple of reasons why I found quite a bit of comfort there. One of them was because the church culture that I was joining was the same one that I had grown up in. And so there were a lot of things that, even though I was in a foreign country, the culture of that particular church denomination was the same. So we would go to church on Saturday and spend all day sort of hanging out together, eating together, and sometimes go on walks or hikes, and that all felt very familiar to me, and it was very comforting in that time in my life where I was so far from home and felt so ungrounded from everything that had been sustaining me. But alongside that, I was also doing a lot of sketchy dating on Tinder. I was going on blind dates with guys, sometimes 2 to 3 times a week, and I was talking to a lot of people on the app, and a lot of them were just sort of one-off coffee dates, and then we would never see each other again. But there were a couple of instances where I actually put myself into some danger. There was one instance where I was out late in Seoul, South Korea, and I went to get chicken with this guy, and by the way, Korean chicken is the best, so you should have some, but anyway, I digress. So I was getting chicken with this guy, but it got too late and the subway closed, and so I thought, well, I'll just go hang out with him at his place. And honestly, I cannot remember what was going through my mind or why I thought it was okay to go hang out with somebody I had just met and didn't know anything about. But we got to his house. I had it in my mind that maybe we were gonna watch a movie or something, but he had something else in his mind, and so he started to get physical with me, and I was not interested in that. So I just very clearly told him, like, I'm not here to sleep with you, and I want to leave. So I started to kind of gather my things, and he walked me out to the elevator, and he said something to me that felt like the voice of God kind of cautioning me, and that was that you should be more careful, because if I wasn't a good guy, then you could be in some danger here. And at the time I was really angry because of that. I thought he was being a jerk by saying that. But also it was true, I was putting myself into some dangerous situations and trusting people who had no business trusting. There was another time when I invited a guy that I barely knew to stay the night with me in my sort of one-room apartment that I had, and in none of those situations did I intend or want to be physical with these people, but I was very careless and just thought that I could do whatever I wanted without consequences. And in hindsight, I'm so thankful for the ways that God fathered me and parented me by protecting me, even in situations where I had clearly put myself in a dangerous place. I had put myself in a vulnerable place. I could have been really hurt. Around, I guess, January was my winter break from school where I was teaching, and I had met this other person on Tinder, and he actually became a really close friend of mine. But initially, for a couple weeks, I thought that I had this really deep connection with him, and I developed feelings very quickly, and we sort of explored the possibility of dating and being together, but all along it seemed like I was getting a message from God saying, like, what are you doing? You have no business dating this person, because he was from Saudi Arabia, and although he had been living in Seoul for quite some time, he did eventually intend to go back home and live there and get married there and have a family there. And so I had this really painful experience where I opened my heart to this person because of the connection that we had, and I guess he realized that I was too emotionally involved and attached, and realized also that it was not going to be good for either one of us to get involved in that way. So he ended up breaking any part of our relationship that was more than friendship off. And I really appreciated that because he protected me in a way by putting a boundary that I, in my lonely and broken and desperate, frankly quite desperate state, was not willing or able to put around my own heart. Throughout this whole time, I was still had a very unhealthy relationship with food and with my body. I would eat in a way that was very out of control and felt very scary. I would just eat without being able to stop. And then because I felt so much shame and guilt and physical pain and physical nausea and illness from these actions, I would then cycle through fasting in order to make myself, I guess, feel like I deserve to eat again. And so it just became this cycle of my anxiety getting out of hand, which then made me sort of eat uncontrollably and binge in order to numb the pain or the anxiety that I was experiencing, and then feel all this shame and self-loathing that would cause me to fast and try to sort of purge those types of feelings that I had. And this happened over and over and over. You can actually see kind of the desperate state that I was in if you look back at some of my videos, particularly the raw vegan challenge. I was really intent on doing some extreme things to be healthy or to fix the feelings that I was having and the eating behaviors that I was having. So I one time tried to eat raw vegan for a whole week, which I don't recommend. And even that, if you watch the video, you can see like how unsuccessful I was and how painful it was for me to feel like a failure, even in the ways that I was trying to cope with all of what was happening. I was also experiencing a lot of chronic pain at that time, and whether that was from unresolved trauma or from the anxiety or from the eating behaviors, I don't really know. But I just know I was in a lot of physical pain, and I actually made a video about experiencing chronic pain, and you can really see kind of a snapshot of where I was at in that time and how dark it was in that video if you go take a look at it. And also, I at one point thought it was a good idea to make a video series where I sort of documented my very unhealthy attempts to lose weight, and you can see that as well. And all of these videos are just, they're interesting to look back at because it's such a profound example of exactly how dark the place that I was in was at that time. The funny thing about it too is that as I continued to go through the year that I was there in Korea, I started to count down until I could go back home to the US, because I started to form this belief that if I just went home, that all of these horrible feelings and horrible behaviors and all of this misery and suffering would just kind of go away. And I guess I founded that belief on this idea that like it had never been that bad before coming to Korea. So I thought that it would be just everything would be fixed by changing my circumstances. But spoiler alert, that was not the case. Another thing I want to talk about from this time of my life was that I invited my mom over my winter break in Korea to come and visit me, because she had never really had a chance to travel anywhere in the whole world. The way that her life had been, that just had not been an option for her. So I wanted her to be able to share in what I was experiencing and sort of have the joy of having that memory together. And so I booked her a ticket, and she flew over to see me, and we stayed with my friend, the one that I had mentioned previously. And while she was there, it brought up a lot of trauma for me, because at that time in her life, she was really experiencing a lot of instability, and when she came, the way that she was behaving while she was there was very triggering to me. I think the thing that was the most painful for me is that I had missed her so much during the time that I had been living in Korea for about 6 months. I hadn't seen her, and when she came, she was really interested in Korea and in filming her experience of being there, and that triggered me because I just really wanted to spend time with her and have quality time, and I didn't really want to follow around, I guess, behind her while she just filmed everything that we were doing and sort of like wasn't very present with me. Again, the way that I coped with those triggers and the pain was to go on a really extreme fast while she was there, and because it felt like I could subdue the pain through fasting. I was experiencing all of these triggers of my trauma in the past, and I was experiencing extreme guilt, shame, and really like just disgust with myself and my body. And it was all because of the fact that my eating was just completely out of control. I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried, get a control over these behaviors around eating. And it's interesting because that lack of control that I felt around my eating behaviors made me feel like everything in my entire life was completely out of control. And so that increased my anxiety and increased my sort of feelings of misery, of just feeling like I was spinning out, I was unraveling, I was completely out of control. And that's pretty much the story of the rest of the time that I was in Korea. Sometimes I was better than other times at coping, using the exercise, using the different behaviors of fasting, sort of pushing it all down or trying to control it. But I just started counting down the days till coming home because of that belief that if I could just go back to a more familiar environment, that all of these problems would sort of just go to sleep or go away. So the time came eventually for me to return to the US, to come home, and I decided I was going to spend the summer in Montana because I had a free flight to go wherever I wanted. My program paid for me to come home, and so instead of flying straight back to North Carolina, I decided to fly out to Montana, spend the summer there, get a summer job, go hiking in the mountains up there because I have a lot of family who lives there, and when I was a child I used to visit a few times with my dad to see his family, and I had just absolutely fallen in love with the beauty and the wildness of the country in Montana. So I got on a plane and I came home, and I was so relieved to be home, just to be in a place where I didn't have to try so hard all the time to figure things out, because I didn't speak the language in Korea, and all of the systems, the buses, the transit, the banking, everything was so foreign and unfamiliar, and I had to use a lot of energy to figure it out. And so I remember saying to my family when I came home, I may still be in an unfamiliar place in Montana where I haven't spent a lot of time, but at least everything is in English. I'm familiar with the systems and I can work it out. Yeah, so my initial plan was only to spend the summer in Montana and then to fly home and start my career as a teacher and figure out how to do that. However, when I got to Montana, I started looking for jobs and started applying, and the only things that I found there were actual jobs working with children, and working as a teaching assistant, and I kept looking for jobs in my hometown, and I wasn't finding anything that matched what I wanted to do at all. So I started to shift my plan. The more that I looked at jobs, the more I started to think that maybe I would just stay in Montana for that entire year, the whole school year, and work there. And in the meantime, I could decide if what my dad always used to tell me about it being super snowy and really cold was enough to actually make me not want to live there. Because when I was growing up, he would always say things like, well, you know, winter lasts 9 months in Montana and it's really cold and you're just stuck in the house all the time and you get cabin fever and go stir crazy. And he would explain that that was why he had moved away. But I was starting to realize that people sometimes exaggerate about the weather in the place where they live. And so it would be better for me to kind of test it out and see if what he was saying was really my experience. And I wasn't finding any jobs in my hometown in teaching, which is what I wanted to do. And yet I was finding jobs working with kids and teaching in Montana. So I decided to accept a couple of jobs that I found. One was working as an assistant teacher in a primary Montessori classroom, and the other one was a part-time position at a children's shelter. And I was really excited about that because I had an interest in alternative education methods in college, and we had toured a Montessori classroom, so I was really excited to see more of the Montessori curriculum and education system in action. And I was excited to work with kids from the children's shelter because I had kind of grown up with some trauma, and I felt like I had something to offer in the way of sort of empathy and understanding and love for those children. So for a couple months after I returned to Montana, I really did feel like my plan was working and that I was saved by just coming back. I felt like a lot of my anxiety was from living in Korea, and really was just from culture shock. And I felt saved by just returning home. I felt really grounded by being in a place that I loved and had always loved from childhood. My brothers came to visit me, and we did a ton of hiking, and going on adventures just gave me a lot of joy. And being with my dad's family, who I hadn't really had a chance to see very much of growing up, was really comforting and reassuring to me. So during that time, I didn't have very much anxiety, and I was really experiencing sort of a peaceful escape in a way from all of the mental health challenges that I had had in Korea. But pretty soon, about a couple months after I got to Montana and found a room to rent and got settled in my new place and got settled in my new work routines, all of the loneliness and despair and sort of desperateness that I had had in Korea kind of came back. And so I started to, again, use coping skills of going on these blind dates from Tinder and try to find somebody, because I thought if I could just find a partner, then all of my emptiness and sadness and loneliness and anxiety would just magically disappear. So as the anxiety and the loneliness and all of that started to re-emerge, I started to cope with that by returning to some of the same behaviors that I had had in Korea of extreme exercising, overeating, binge eating, and then fasting in order to make myself feel less ashamed and less condemned and less disgusted with my own self and my body. The fact that I was working 2 jobs initially seemed like a good idea because it was gonna help me to provide for myself. But a couple months into it, I realized that it was running me ragged because I was working 6 days a week, and sometimes I was leaving my school job to go to my other job and work another 5 or 6 hour shift. And it turned out to really negatively affect my mental health, increase my anxiety and my exhaustion, and also the things that I was encountering while working with the kids at the shelter was really triggering my own trauma that I had not addressed. So it was causing me a lot of pain because I felt inadequate to meet their needs, and also pain because I was being triggered into my eating behaviors, and more self-loathing and shame because of that. To sort of make matters worse, I wasn't connected with any sort of faith community or church at the time. I hadn't been able to find one that I felt at home or felt like I could relate to well. And I had family that I could spend time with, but I really didn't have any friends because I had just moved there as well. So in October of 2017, which was about 3 months after I had moved to Montana, I met another person on Tinder, and as it was kind of typical of all of the guys that I dated on Tinder, I had some connection with them, enough to be interested or attracted to them, but they were people who I really had no business getting involved with, following in the same pattern that I had in Korea, even before I went to Korea, when I got involved with the Marine guy, and then got involved with a guy from Saudi Arabia, and then finally moving to Montana, I met this guy who was a philosophy major at the University of Montana and had absolutely zero values in common with me, and to the point that he didn't believe in God's existence at all, and he had a really dark worldview that frankly quite frightened me. And yet, because of my abject desperation and loneliness, I got involved with him anyway. And it was really quite a toxic relationship because neither one of us were mentally well. He was experiencing quite a bit of depression, and he was still quite brokenhearted over a former relationship, and he was also coping with that by basically being high all the time. And so none of that was really in line with what I was looking for in a partner, or really very stabilizing to me when I was in that dark place. It was not maybe 2 weeks into having met one another and spending time together, sort of trying to have a relationship, that we discovered point blank that our relationship was not going to work because of how unhealthy we both were. The relationship ended after a couple of weeks, but rather than cut ties and work on what I was going through, I decided to maintain this friends with benefits relationship with this guy, all because of being lonely and being desperate and just really being broken down. So on and off for several months, we would still like get together and spend time together and sleep together, and that was hard on me because I'd gone from being a young idealistic child and wanting to only experience my sexuality with the person that I was going to be with forever, to being willing to be sexual with anyone who would take me, basically. And so you can imagine that probably did not help my feelings of self-worth and self-loathing and just kind of anxiety as well. I was not living in accordance with any of the values that I held to be important or beautiful or good for me or anything like that. So meanwhile, as that is all happening, the trauma triggers at the shelter, some stress from working the 2 jobs back to back, it really ramped up my anxiety and sent me into a tailspin of just binge eating and fasting to try to preserve some shred of self-worth. Around the time that I was wrapped up in this relationship with this guy, I also was talking to my coworker at the shelter about how I was looking for a church community and I hadn't found one, and she graciously invited me to spend some time with her church group because they had a ministry for sort of young professional people around my age, and they would do social events and other types of things. So I started to go with her to these types of events and eventually decided to study the Bible with her and a couple of other young women from this church that I started going to. So this was about January or February of 2018 when she and a couple of other girls started studying the Bible with me. And I really appreciated the way that she reached out to me and that their community reached out to me, because it was a really dark time in my life, and suddenly God provided this group of women to support me and be my friends when I didn't have anyone else. One of the first studies that I ever did with this girl was called Seeking God, and it had a profound impact on me because what she was doing in the study with me was asking me questions to sort of help me come to an understanding of whether or not I even was interested in seeking God, because there's no point in continuing to study the Bible if my deepest motivations are not in line with seeking God. So in this study, through the questions that she was asking me, the Holy Spirit really impressed on me that I had been seeking relationships with men because I felt like I was a good partner in a relationship, and I felt like I desired to be in a relationship with someone because I felt like I had so much to give in terms of loyalty, respect, and love, and kindness, and all of those things. And the Holy Spirit revealed to me that I had pride in that area, that I thought that I was such a good partner. But He also pointed out to me very gently that I had never actually used any of those quote-unquote great qualities of a partner to seek a relationship with Him, that I had always run after men and sought relationships with men and felt really proud of my ability to be a good partner with a man, and yet I was like the worst partner when it came to being a relational partner with God, because I was completely unfaithful to Him, and I just pursued all of the things that I cared about and didn't hardly pay Him any attention unless I was in trouble. He just gently impressed upon my heart that I had always put Him last in my life. And it was interesting because the way that He impressed it on me was not a way that brought shame or condemnation or guilt, but rather just brought a level of sadness into my heart that I had thought I was so good at relationships, and yet I had never given even a shred of that to God. And so I made the decision in that moment that I was going to do one thing in the following week to give Him evidence of my repentance, my desire to actually seek a relationship with Him. Not that I had to do anything to show it, But when he revealed to me in that moment that I hadn't been seeking him, that I hadn't been relationally faithful to him, that I hadn't pursued him at all in a relationship, he also aroused the desire in my heart to seek him. And so with that desire came this desire to do something to show him that I wanted to seek him. So I decided that the following week I was going to reach out to this lady that I knew and get a book called The Desire of Ages, which just goes into a lot of detail about the life of Christ, and it follows the structure that the Gospels are written, but it kind of synthesizes it all. So she dropped the book off at my door and I picked it up and I started reading it. And this was probably the lowest moment of my mental health and even physical health since returning from Korea, because I was experiencing such high anxiety, exhaustion, chronic fatigue, and my eating behaviors were really out of control. I was just binge eating a whole box of cereal, a whole pound of granola or something, whatever it was that I had, and I just felt really in a low and dark place. And it was at that moment that I picked up that book and started to read it. And there's not going to be a way for me to explain it very well, but I'll just try to do my best and say that it was an incredibly profound spiritual experience to pick up that book and start reading it, because I had set out to read that book just to show God in some small way that I had changed my heart towards him and that my heart really did desire to seek him. And it was hardly anything. It wasn't a big show of affection for me to pick up that book. It was just simply a small way that I was turning towards him. And yet, it felt like the floodgates of heaven opened, literally, and poured into my life, because grace came into my life in a way I had never experienced it before. From the very first day that I picked up that book, the thing that I least expected happened, which was that all of my anxiety, all of my binge eating, all of my pain and despair and loneliness just completely dissolved. It felt like I was just washed with joy and peace. And as a result of that profound experience of peace in the midst of a really dark moment, I sat and I thought to myself, if this is the peace and this is the joy and this is the life that I can experience when I have a relationship with God, then this is all I want. There's nothing else that matters. And that's when I can say I truly fell in love with Jesus, because I had never experienced a miracle of that magnitude in my entire life before, of going from one day just being completely at my darkest moment with anxiety, at my darkest moment feeling so out of control in how I was relating to food, to just having peace and joy for absolutely no reason, undeserved, unasked for, just completely transformed. And I had no other way of responding to that grace and love that poured into my life without being asked for, except for just complete adoration and worship and complete love response towards Jesus, because I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I hadn't done any of it for myself, that the only difference between me today and me last week was the fact that I had picked up a book about Christ's life and started reading it, and that somehow God had responded to my heart towards him with an inexpressible love towards me, and that just wrecked me and changed my life forever. But that is not the end of the story. There's much more going to happen from there. So those behaviors that I had been struggling with and those really miserable, dark feelings were gone from my life for about 4 or 5 months, from about February until I started a new chapter in my life that summer. And at the same time, the Holy Spirit spoke to me that I could trust Him to take care of me, to provide for my needs, and that I didn't have to work 2 jobs if it was gonna be detrimental to my health, that I could just rest in His provision. And so because of that, I ended up deciding to quit my second job at the shelter, and just really acknowledging that I was not in a good place to provide what I so desperately wanted to provide for the children I was working with, which was just love and light and joy and peace. But I was not ready myself. I had not worked through what I needed to work through to be that kind of a non-anxious presence in that shelter. And so I quit my second job, and God provided for me in spite of circumstances. It looked like I wouldn't be able to survive on the one job because I was only making very low wage as an assistant in my school. But in spite of that, I was able to survive financially, and God took care of me. Around that time, probably March of that year, I also decided to end the relationship with the guy that I had been sleeping with, because I had this newfound heart full of love for Jesus, and I knew that that was not what I even wanted to do, and I doubted that it was what He was wanting for me. So throughout the spring, I was doing much better with my mental health because of the grace that God gave me. I was still studying the Bible with my friends. I got pretty involved in their church community, and I decided to go ahead and apply to a master's program for teaching elementary Montessori, because after being in the classroom as an assistant for that year, I was fairly sold on the beauty and the developmentally appropriateness of Montessori pedagogy. So I started doing research, and I found this master's program in Spokane that really combined all of the things I felt like I wanted to do, which was to get my master's, to get my Montessori training, and also to get my public school teaching license. And it was all very much provided for by God, because I applied at the very, very last minute in like April, right before the program was supposed to start in June. And I had no money saved up. I had no connections in Spokane for a place to live. So in the summer of 2018, I went to Spokane and I started my master's in my elementary training. And it was a new chapter for me because I was back in school, which had been a big trigger for my anxiety in college as well, was just the demands of the deadlines and all of that comes with a rigorous academic program. So I had that stress back in my life, and I also discovered about 4 or 5 weeks into being there that my living situation was not going to work out, because the person that I was staying with in exchange for helping them around the house had more expectations of me than I could meet. And so that became a huge stressor. And I was still coping with my feelings of worthlessness and inadequacy by exercising. That was actually the summer that I was training to do a half marathon. So I was out running like 12 to 13 miles once a week, and then total over the course of the week I was running more like 27, 29 miles a week. So I was really doing some extreme exercise, and I started to use Tinder again as a way to cope with the stressors that I was experiencing with school and my living arrangement. So by the end of the summer 2018, I strongly felt that I needed to get a job in an elementary classroom because I was learning all of the theory behind elementary practice, and yet I was working in a preschool environment in a 3 to 6 year old classroom. And I felt like if I want to really apply what I'm learning, I need to work in an elementary classroom. So I found a job within a couple of weeks, but the job was in Portland, Oregon. So what ended up happening was God really helped me to accomplish that as well, because I didn't know a single person in Portland either, and I didn't have hardly any money for a living situation. So I packed all my stuff up and I moved to Portland with my cat, and I had planned to live with a person I met on Craigslist who was offering a room for rent, and I kind of explained my situation, explained how I didn't really have that much money, but just kind of asked the person to be gracious and work with me around rent. And incidentally, I had also found the living situation that I had in Spokane on Craigslist, and that didn't work out well either. So if you have a bad experience, don't do something more than once like I did. So I got moved into my new place and I started working, and the first thing I wanted to do was find out what kind of guys are on Tinder in this new place that I have moved to, because that had worked out so well in the past. But within about 3 months of moving to Portland, I was back in a really bad situation, and a lot of things were just really getting bad actually in my life all around the same time. I found out from living there that the landlady was actually an alcoholic and was really unhealthy presence to be around. She was verbally and emotionally abusive towards me, and I also was working in a pretty toxic environment in the school that I had got a job at, just struggling to deal with the behaviors of the students and also the relationship with the lead teacher in my classroom, which was not always smooth. The school culture at that school that I worked with was also a challenge for me, sort of owing to my own trauma around authority figures and that kind of thing. And to put the icing on the cake, things were really getting a lot worse in my mom's life as well at that time. She had some very awful things happen to her around that time that really grieved and pained me when I found out about it. And also my relationship with her was at pretty much its darkest point that it had ever been in, and she'd blocked me from calling her, and it was just really rough with her as well. And I had no family in Portland. In the midst of all of that, because I was still using Tinder as a coping mechanism, I went on this one blind date with a guy in Portland, and it was super scary, probably the scariest one that I had experienced. It was interesting to me how throughout all of my time of using Tinder to cope, God just used it as a means to speak to me about, I guess, his plan that he had for me that was better. And it very much felt like he was trying to reveal to me how Tinder was not going to be a good solution in my life. It was not going to bring life to me. And he revealed that through each and every one of the relationships that I found on Tinder being less and less of what I was looking for, sharing fewer and fewer of my values, and being less and less of an option. And this scary Tinder date that I had in Portland ended up actually being the very last one that I ever went on, because it felt like God was very loudly speaking to me through it, saying, "You're not going to find what you're looking for here." And the reason it felt like that was what he was saying is because I had this belief that one of the reasons why none of the guys I had met on Tinder ever worked out was because we didn't share the same values, in the sense that they were not Christian and didn't grow up Seventh-day Adventist, so they didn't share my same values. But this person that I went on this final date on Tinder with, one of the first things he said to me when I texted him was that he grew up Seventh-day Adventist. And so I was very curious and very interested, and I met up with him. But all I can explain about it was that I'm really sensitive to people's emotional and spiritual energy, and he had a very dark spiritual energy. He was saying things to me that were really alarming to me, like saying that he wanted to raise his children STA even though he didn't believe himself, but he just felt like it was a good environment for children to be in or grow up in. All I can explain it is that my intuition was telling me to get as far away as possible from this person. And yet in the middle of our meetup, my car would not start, and so I was forced to actually go with this person to his house and get jumper cables to jump my car. And then when we came back, I realized that the reason it wouldn't start is because it was not actually in park. I had just turned it off in drive and then I guess set the emergency brake so that it didn't move, but it won't actually start like that. So we tried to jump the car, and when I discovered that I had actually made the mistake of leaving it in drive and that's the reason why it wouldn't start and it had nothing to do with a dead battery, this person actually got angry at me, saying, "How could you make me go all the way to my house to get the jumper cables?" I don't exactly remember what he said, but he was just trying to convey that his time was really valuable and I had wasted his time, and that he didn't care about what I was going through or what I was experiencing at all. And that was really scary for me because it triggered a lot of trauma that I had experienced. I drove home from that experience. It was really late at early in the morning, and I could just hear God's voice ringing in my ears saying that I'm trying to prove you wrong. I'm trying to prove that you're not going to find what you're really looking for through this dating app. And if that's not evident to you by now, I don't know what else I can do. I'm really trying to save you from these types of dangerous situations that you're putting yourself in. So the same night that scary date happened, a little bit earlier that evening, I had gone to Vespers. It was like a gathering of young adults from a church that my friend in Spokane had told me about before I had moved there. She said, if you're looking for a church, this is where you should go because this church has a lot of people your age. And so she had recommended it to me. So back when I realized I was going to move to Portland, I decided to join their Facebook group, and on their Facebook group they would post events that were happening. And I don't know how many times there were different events that I didn't go to because I was sort of fighting against this fear of showing up to a new place with all new people, and just how overwhelming it was for me at the time because I was experiencing a lot of social anxiety. A lot of my eating behaviors at this time would come out in social situations because for some reason it would heighten my anxiety, and there would also often be food in these sorts of social gatherings. So it was really hard for me sometimes to go to places where there was going to be groups of people that I didn't feel comfortable with. So long story short, basically I had been on this Facebook page for months and didn't really go to any of the things that I saw on there because I was anxious about it. And so finally, the same night as I went on this date, before I went on the date, I decided I was going to actually go to one of these events that were showing up on Facebook. And so I went there. I could feel that I was going to be happy there. I was going to love these people and they were going to love me, and it was going to become a really beautiful part of my life. And so then, ironically enough, I went on that date right after I left their house. And after that date, the very morning that it ended and I came back, I actually just went straight to that church, and I remember sitting in my car before I went in just thanking God for protecting me from that person and from that darkness that I was feeling. Just thinking, man, how crazy it was for me to have been out all night with this person, and now here I am, I'm showing up at church. So if you ever feel like you shouldn't show up to church because something you did, don't listen to that voice, because it's not got your best interests at heart. Just go to the places where you feel like there's love, and let love do what love does. In this new church that I had started going to from that day onward, I found so much comfort and joy and community and love that I actually felt like I didn't need to search for it anywhere else anymore. So I canceled my app and I said goodbye to the long years of trying to find love in all of the places that it wasn't going to be found for me. So 3 more months go by. I'm, getting involved in this new community, and the living situation that I was in with the woman that I mentioned before was just getting worse and worse, to the point that I needed to get out of it. It was very triggering for me, and also very, very toxic, just the way that she would speak to me and some of the situations that I got stuck in. But I also didn't have anywhere else to go because I could still barely afford to live. I wasn't really making enough to pay rent in any sort of apartment by myself, and I didn't know anybody who had a room that they could rent. And at this point I was so afraid of renting from people that I didn't know that I didn't feel like that was gonna work out. So the pastor at my church put me in contact with a couple of the elders from church. This couple are both chaplains, and these generous, kind-hearted, loving people ended up giving me a place to stay. So I moved into their travel trailer that they had parked beside their house in the end of 2018 in December. But unfortunately, things for me were going to get worse and get darker before they got better and before there was light in it. So even though my housing situation was taken care of, the anxiety that I was experiencing got a lot worse, because before I moved out to their place, I had lived within 5 minutes of my gym, and I could use exercise as a coping mechanism for my anxiety. But they lived out in the country, so I really couldn't get to my gym. It wasn't feasible for it to be a regular part of my daily routine anymore, because it just wasn't close enough to home. And the eating disorders that came with it also got way worse. And I was also extremely terrified for my mom at this point because of how her life was and what was going on with her. So basically, sometimes you have to end up in a safe place, I think, before all of your coping mechanisms and all your defense mechanisms can sort of come down and you can sort of unclench. And part of that process for me was that I really did come apart at the seams, and all of the misery, all the darkness, all of the death that I had been experiencing kind of came to a head and got worse than it had ever been. So at one point in February, I think it was maybe the end of January or the beginning of February of 2019, my anxiety had gotten so bad that I could not even get out of bed. And it sort of drove me to the point where I decided that I was going to do a water fast indefinitely, because I was so miserable and so anxious and just so full of self-hatred and shame that I could not function. And so I decided that the way to get rid of that was to just fast. And if I could just fast and lose all the weight that I had gained from my eating disorder, that everything would be better. It was a moment of desperation for me. I was desperate enough to do anything it took to lessen these intense feelings of shame and self-loathing that I had. And fasting, in my experience, had relieved those feelings, at least temporarily in the past. So I just decided I was gonna fast indefinitely, and I was utterly broken over what was happening with my mom at the time, because she had started to live again with the boyfriend who abused me as a child at that time. It felt like in that moment I was finally being honest in a way with God that I had never been before, and finally like internally thinking to him, like praying to him and thinking, this is what I'm gonna be like. This broken, devastated, desperate person this is what I'm gonna be like. I'm gonna fast and I'm gonna destroy myself if you don't intervene. And I think that was what I was praying during that time. And I was just trying to be honest with him, I think. And the friends that I was staying with, the chaplains who were elders at our church, they were in the perfect place at that time, and I think just so well placed by God to minister grace to me, to minister support in a deep grief that I was experiencing over my mom, and to just provide so much comfort to me in the midst of everything that I was going through. And I think that God was allowing, because of his desire to heal me and to free me, he let things get intense in order to drive me to himself. But he had no plans to leave me in that place of pain, and that's been something that has repeated itself over and over in my healing process, is that something may feel really intense, and in that moment I know that God is healing me, because he does not inflict pain unnecessarily. He only draws out the pain that is there so that he can take it away. So to some extent, even though I wasn't being honest with people around me about what was going on completely, my friends, the chaplains, and my pastor at the church knew to some extent what I was going through. They knew, for example, that I wasn't eating. So they made me a gift, and the gift was in the form of a scrapbook. And in the scrapbook, they collected things that were emblems of the love of God towards me specifically. And all I can say is that must have been the Spirit speaking to my friend and telling her what exactly I needed, because when I opened that scrapbook, the heart of God spoke to me specifically and personally from the pages. Before they gave me the scrapbook, they held a ceremony of anointing for me, where they prayed over me and sang songs over me. And that really wrecked me and brought me to a place where I realized that I needed to give up control of my eating, of my weight, of my diet, of my exercise, of everything. And that the reason it was safe to give up that control is because God loves me and will take care of me. During that time, the Spirit of God really spoke to me through some music that I heard. For example, there's a song called Heart of God by Hillsong, and in that song the person is talking about coming before God as honestly as they know how, because all they want is the heart of God and all they want is surrender. And I just felt that on a really deep and visceral level, like that was the desire of my heart. was just to be enfolded by the heart of God and to let go of everything else. I will put the lyrics to that song in the description as well. So in that moment with my pastor and the chaplains and their family there, I made the choice to surrender, to give up my control. At that point, I had been fasting, only drinking tea and water for like 9 days. And so in that moment when I decided, because of the love of God, I can release this control that I've been trying to impose, I allowed myself to eat again. After that, I broke my fast. And there was a lot of tears, and I repented of trying to control everything. But the beauty of it is that God had so much more for me than that, because he knew that I was in a really, really tender place and that I didn't yet have all the tools that I needed to walk out healed and free from the past. The very week after that, the Love Reality tour with Jonathan Leonardo came to our church, and I'm going to link that in the description because it has brought so much life to so many people. So if you're touched by my story and you want to hear what I heard that made such a difference for me, then you can check it out in the description. From that week of sessions where Jonathan Leonardo proclaimed the gospel to us, I learned some really important things that allowed me to be able to stand in the healing that God was working in my life, and to walk in freedom from my eating disorder and from my self-loathing and from my shame and from all of that, from my trauma even. So that week I learned some really amazing things. I learned finally everything that I had died for the lack of knowing and understanding. I learned that I am free from sin and completely forgiven for anything that I've done and anything that I ever will do. I learned that I'm justified by Christ's sacrifice, and that I'm just as if I had never sinned in the Lord's eyes, in God's eyes. For me, that meant that even though I had gained weight and I felt so ashamed of my eating disorder that had caused my weight gain, that I was just as if I had never ever abused my body in that way. I learned that I am God's beloved daughter, and that my identity as God's beloved daughter is why Jesus gave his life for me, for everyone, so that I would learn how much I was worth, that I was worth the very life of God, because I was priceless to him, which is why he gave his life. I learned that my worth doesn't come from my circumstances or my traumas or what I've done or what's been done to me, but rather my worth comes from what was willing to be paid for me, which was God's very life. Okay, so we are back because my phone decided to stop recording right in the middle of what I was saying. I learned that my worth doesn't come from anything less than the fact that the infinite, uncreated creator of the universe would give his entire life for me. I learned that I am worth what was willing to be paid for me, which is the very life of God himself, which means I am infinitely worthy and totally separate from anything I did or didn't do or said or didn't say, or anything that has been done or said to me. I learned that I can rest in my Father's love as he fulfills the very deepest desires of my heart, including my desires to be a wife, to become a mother someday. I learned that in accepting Jesus, I've been made totally brand new, a new creation, completely restored, as if nothing had ever hurt me or I had done anything wrong. Totally healed and restored to who I was always meant to be, whole and complete forever. One thing I want to highlight and make clear as I'm sort of coming to the end of the story is that all of the moments in my life have been a process of coming into the identity and the life that I now understand and live in, but that there was one moment that was very special to me, and that was the moment when the reality of love came crashing into the reality that I had been living in, which was death and despair and brokenness, and changed my life forever. And I want to talk about that a little bit before I close the video. In James 1 verses 8, the brother of Jesus writes that a person who is double-minded is unstable in all of their ways. And to be double-minded, to me, means to be unsure of what is true. That uncertainty about reality was a big part of why I was so miserable for so long, because the circumstances of my life had often spoken to me about what is reality. They had often indicated to me that I was unloved and unworthy of love because of the things that I had been through or the things that I had done. As a result, I lived under a heavy load of self-condemnation, self-hatred, and shame for my overeating, for my compulsive behaviors of dating and seeking relationships. I believed that my identity was made up of what I did and what happened to me, and it made me hate myself because what I did was completely out of control and completely compulsive. And my identity was made up of what happened to me, which was traumatic and painful and deeply wounding to my very existence. Because of the fact that I was finding my identity in such dark places and such dark beliefs, such painful beliefs, when I would hear that God loved me, that would not even get past my understanding part of my brain, because I couldn't possibly believe that I was loved when all of my circumstances were telling me something different. When my feelings of shame and self-loathing and pain and anxiety were so intense and so real to me, I couldn't possibly identify with a reality where I was loved and healed. I couldn't hear or accept or receive how personal and substantial and real the love of God was for me. So when I heard through the LRT message that Christ had given himself up completely and totally, emptied himself, and even died so that I could live under a better word than my own circumstances and feelings were speaking to me, my own actions were speaking to me, the better word of his love and how much I was worth to him, there was a moment when I had to choose which reality was I going to identify with. I had to choose to not be double-minded, not hear and with one part of myself believe in a reality of love, and also identify with all of these things that were not part of love. Self-loathing is not part of love. Shame is not part of love. And so I had to decide to cut ties with those thoughts and those feelings that were not part of the reality of love. There was a moment when I had to choose to die to the life of condemnation and shame, of control that I had been living, and to consciously choose to accept and trust in the reality of love that God speaks about me. So during the whole week when the Love Reality Tour was at our church, I was processing and digesting these ideas about finding my identity in the Word of God, in the love of God that He speaks over me. And all the while I was in a state of pain because I felt like I wanted to be free. I wanted to be loved. I wanted to believe that I was worthy and believe all of these good things about me, but I didn't know how. I felt like I didn't know how to believe, and I felt trapped in this place of still identifying with all of the negative self-talk and all of the negative feelings toward myself that I had had for 26 years. All of the things that people had spoken over me for 26 years felt really hard to let go of and to stop believing, because they were my only reality for so long. But on the last day that Jonathan was at our church, we were worshiping and we were singing the song Whole Heart by Hillsong. And in that moment, the Spirit did a very deep and profound work within me through the lyrics of the song. The words were amplified in the lyrics of the song, and they were perfectly crafted to express what the Holy Spirit was doing in my heart at that moment. And I just broke down in tears because I felt the tender closeness of a love like I had never experienced before. In that moment, the Spirit just came upon me and loosened me from the chains that I didn't know how to break myself, the beliefs and the negative garbage self-talk that I had believed for all those years. They just fell away as we sang this song, and as I just wept and cried, and just from the very core of my being, in both deep sorrow and deep joy at what was happening, the healing that I could feel within me was happening. The way that the Spirit speaks to us each is so individual to each person and so tender. It's the most loving, kind voice you will ever hear. And in the lyrics of the song, it said this to me: "Hold me now in the hands that created the heavens. Find me now where the grace runs as deep as your scars. You pulled me from the clay. You set me on a rock. You called me by your name, daughter, and you made my heart whole again. So here I stand, high in surrender. Once I was broken, but you loved my whole heart through. Sin has no hold on me now, but your grace owns the ground where the grave did, where all my shame remains left for dead in your wake. You stepped out of that grave and shouldered me all the way, healed and forgiven. Look where my chains are now." And in that moment, it just felt as if all the chains of sin, of self-hatred, of self-obsession, of brokenness, of trauma, they just all fell around me, and I was just left with a whole heart, healed, unbroken, unscarred, unmarked by any of those things that I had done or believed about myself. And He's continued speaking to me even now. He continues to speak life and love, healing over me every day. But I think I want to end the video there because there are many more stories that I have that I want to tell you about. The words that He's spoken to me, the ways that He's loved me, the way He speaks, and the way He moves within our being, within my being, is so deep and profound as to almost be unspeakable. But in those words, the words that spoke the universe into existence, He spoke to me and told me I was worthy, I was daughter, I was righteous, I was healed, I was whole, I am beautiful, I am loved, I need nothing. And I just want to share that with you. I hope that this story has blessed you, that it has resonated with the places where love has shown its light in your life, and I want you to share that with me. I want to hear your stories, because nothing excites or encourages me or inspires me more than hearing people share about the ways that love has broken into their lives, has healed them, has held them. So just thank you for being here. I hope you will share this video if it has encouraged you or inspired you or given you hope or resonated with you. And I hope that this is the beginning of sharing many, many stories about the work of love in each of our lives with one another. So thanks for watching. Until next time, grace and peace.